Welcome to Kepler Conversations. I'm Dr. Scott Postma. Kepler is an online marketplace for classical Christian education. We employ the historic university model and leverage the best available technology so that we can empower families by liberating teachers to make a classical liberal arts education available, accessible, and affordable. Well, in today's conversation, I'm joined by Kepler teacher Tracey Leary. Mrs. Leary is a 30-year resident of Alabama where she homeschooled all of her three boys. She has served as a director, teacher, and upper school curriculum curator for a large homeschool co-op. She's earned degrees in music and English from Huntingdon College, a master's degree in education from Auburn University, and is currently pursuing her doctorate in humanities at Faulkner University. Welcome, Mrs. Leary. Good to have you today.
It's good to be here.
Well, one of the fun things we like to do as we get started, kind of break the ice and let everybody get to know you a little bit, is to learn a little bit about you. So who is Mrs. Leary outside of the classroom?
Okay, well, I grew up in Florida, in the panhandle of Florida, came up to Alabama to go to Huntingdon College and just ended up staying. And have loved classical education from an early age. I taught at a classical school right out of college and getting my master's degree for several years, and ended up homeschooling my boys, and have just been immersed in that world for quite some time. But I also love to read a lot of different things. I love fantasy. My boys have introduced me to Brandon Sanderson. So that's been quite fun to get into his books. And I like to do some needlework. I do some, it's called French hand sewing. I did that a lot when my kids were young. With boys, there's only so much you can do. So maybe one day I'll get the chance to go back and have some grandchildren that I can sew for. But I also do some knitting and cross stitch and work like that.
Oh, fantastic. Well, as you've mentioned, growing up in Florida and then moving to Alabama, for your formal education and falling in love with classical education. I'm interested to know a little bit about maybe your less formal education or prior to your college education. Were you public school educated? Were you homeschooled? What is your journey into classical education?
Yeah, I was public school. I went through public school all the way. I came from Panama City at that time, was a fairly small town. The public schools were very, very good. And I really found my love of literature there, especially in the high school. I always loved to read, but when I was a senior in high school, we had an AP English course with two teachers who had been teaching together for 20 years. And so they each had their own separate classes, but they would always combine us, and they would finish each other's sentences, and they traveled to England together, and they were just tremendous, and really fell in love with British literature under their instruction. So I really had a fabulous experience myself in public school. But as I moved on into college and began learning about the classical education movement that was very new back when I was in college, my church at the time decided to start a little classical school, and I ended up teaching for them for a few years. But really, that's where I began to learn about classical education, and I think so many classical teachers say this. I wish this is how I had been taught. And I had a fabulous education. I really did, looking back in so many ways. But I realized that there was so much more out there, and really began to have a passion for teaching that way and giving kids what even more than what I had, what I really wish I had had.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like one of the fortunate ones to have experienced a good public school education, and yet still so many things that adds the richness. I remember, in our own personal experience, having started a couple of Christian schools, not knowing about classical, but always striving. There was something like we were missing. We were trying to get our minds wrapped around a few things that we couldn't. And when I discovered classical, I realized this is it. This is the, it's scratching that itch that we've had for so long. So yeah, those are great experiences to find how that, really restores and fulfills those gaps.
Mhm.
Well, so you've been teaching now at Kepler some very popular classes for several years now. Classes that typically fill up and have waiting room or needing open second section. So that says something. There's a lot of things I could say, but it does certainly say something about your teaching and about the curriculum that you're providing. So, can you talk a little bit about your experience at Kepler and the courses you're teaching here, and what are your favorite aspects, and who are they for? Talk a little bit about that, if you would.
Sure. I brought my kids home. My kids, I have three boys, and they're stair steps. We started them out at the same little classical school where I taught for a few years. My middle son needed a little extra attention, so I brought him home for first grade, homeschooled him, and always really sort of dreamed about homeschooling the kids, but was a little intimidated at having three little boys, and so I have nothing but respect for moms who start out homeschooling. I did not do that. But I brought my middle son home in first grade. We loved it, had a wonderful year. Brought my oldest son home the next year, and then my youngest son, Marshall, never went to a brick and mortar school. We homeschooled him all the way through. So as we came home to homeschool, a co-op began here in town that I got involved in. And our kids, as the elementary age students moved up into secondary, needing a secondary program, I stepped in to help with that and ended up developing a curriculum that I hoped was a gentle introduction to the great books. And so that's been my philosophy, is that especially for middle school students, they need to exposure to the great books. They need to encounter them, but they need to do it in a gentle way.
Mm.
And a lot of the curriculum that was out there at the time was I knew was not going to be a good fit for the families that we had in that co-op. They needed something a little softer to ease into it with, but I didn't want to give up the idea of true encounter with the great books. So we did that. And so I was able over several years to sort of develop this curriculum with the pandemic and everything, as the co-op ended up, having to not be able to meet for several years. And that was just about the time that Kepler got started. And so that's why I was able to come on board with Kepler. So that is my basic philosophy, is that I want kids to have an encounter with the great books. I want them to develop a relationship with them, hopefully an affectionate one. So we spend a lot of time just enjoying the books together and having fun with them. My assessments are very open-ended. I call them narrative assessments, so that kids are choosing the parts of what we read together in class that have spoken most to them. They are retelling those sections, and they're relating them to their own personal wealth of stories and their own interior library, and finding where those stories connect with everything that has already been built up in them over, most of these kids are homeschooled, and so over a decade of really, really good books. And so I'm trying to help them see where the great books fit into their own wheelhouse already, rather than seeing them as something completely different and really, really difficult. So I want to make them accessible without sacrificing any of the challenge or any of the I don't want to water it down in any way. They're encountering the real deal. We're just hopefully doing it in a way that is not intimidating and that is going to make it accessible to them and to whet their appetite for going on with their studies.
That's really good. We just having a conversation recently with somebody about the idea that rigor doesn't have to be sacrificed for scole, right? So you can have that leisurely, that gentle introduction that you talked about, and develop that affection without it being less than an encounter. And really, what it does is it cultivates that lifelong love for learning, where it does, like, I love the phrase you use, having an affectionate relationship with these great books, because they become friends. And I find it fascinating that we often have to talk about just enjoying the books. Like, don't forget to do that, because we live in this empirical modern world where everything has to be measured and calculated, and forget the fact that part of the pleasure of reading them is what cultivates that wonder and curiosity and joy for a lifelong learning. So I really appreciate that you bring that to the table. Which specifically, which courses are you teaching, and how are they, how are they offered?
My courses are called Introduction to the Great Books, and I have a section for ancients, a section for medievals, a section for early moderns, and a new section for the Revolutionary era books, the American and French revolutions and what led up to that. And so they're really meant to be sort of graduated, but really students can jump in at any point. But my ancients course is geared mostly for 6th through 8th graders, although I do have 9th and 10th graders who take it, and it's perfectly appropriate for them to do that. I have medievals is 7th through 9th grade, early moderns 8th through 10th, and the Revolutionary era will be geared for 9th through 11th graders. So those are my main courses.
Okay, excellent. I remember hearing early on, in a teacher training where we were, when I was learning as an educator, talking about how age only, a student's age or grade only tells you basically when they were born, and every student can engage at different levels wherever they're at, and that's perfectly appropriate. So I love that you offer that range of opportunity, gearing it for a particular age, but also having that flexibility for each individual student. And then having ancients, so an integrated humanities approach to the ancient world, then to the medieval, early moderns, and then moving into that very expansive modern era of revolution, and with the American Revolution or War for Independence. So wonderful, wonderful offering across the board. And then there's another course that you teach that has been highly popular over the years, and it features Jane Austen. Can you talk about that course a little bit?
Yes, Jane Austen and the Virtues. We read 3 of Jane Austen's novels per semester. I'm actually teaching a summer course where we're just doing Emma, which is a wonderful summer book. But we look at the way that Jane Austen uses the classical and theological virtues and then the vices, as well, in the way that she delineates her characters and the impact that those characters have in their behavior has, of course, on the story and on each other. And we look at the Aristotelian. We read some primary source documents from Aristotle, from St. Augustine, from Thomas Aquinas, looking at their definitions of different virtues. And then we see how Jane Austen's work really lines up so beautifully with that. So, for example, one word that Jane Austen uses very, very often is the word disinterested. And if someone acts in a disinterested manner, that is like the highest pinnacle of morality for them. And it aligns really beautifully with Thomas Aquinas' definition of charity, which is willing the good for the sake of the other. So that there's no interest for yourself, the interest is all for the other person. So that's just one example of how she uses these ideas so beautifully in her stories.
Oh, that's wonderful. I know that course has been widely popular throughout the years, and I'm really glad that you offer it. And I love, just kind of going back, I want to just kind of reemphasize the fact that in enjoying these books, learning these virtues, I guess it reminds me somewhat of what Livy said about the medicine for a sick mind is history, right? Or reading these stories where we see the vices that we want to eschew, and we see the virtues that we want to embrace, not necessarily in an analytical way, but just experiencing them, encountering them. And we get to encounter these characters in her novels. And, she's so good at that.
And the wonderful thing about Jane Austen is there's very few characters as subtle as her characterization of them is there are very few characters in her novels that you're really neutral about.
Yeah.
You either really like them or you really don't by the end of the story, and there are reasons for that. And so, yes, it's a wonderful way to introduce kids to the idea of virtue ethics and the difference that it makes in our lives and in the lives of our stories.
Absolutely. Well, you've given us some really good examples or good perspective on the courses that you're teaching. I'm wondering as we kind of begin to wind down just a little bit, if you could give us perhaps a nugget, from one of your courses. I don't know, maybe there's an intriguing story or a historical fact. Maybe there's a spin or corrective about a popular but wrong idea. Just something maybe that would kind of whet the appetite of our audience.
In my new course, we'll be reading The Scarlet Letter.
Mm.
And The Scarlet Letter is such a beautiful book. But one thing people don't always realize about The Scarlet Letter is that it is a fairy tale.
Ooh.
And if you get to the end of the book, chapter 23, at the scene where everything comes together, there is one particular line, and I won't spoil it, but that line clearly delineates The Scarlet Letter as a fairy tale. And then when you go back and look at the way Hawthorne has structured it, and we know that Hawthorne loved fairy tales. He wrote many books for children, Tanglewood Tales and other retellings of Greek myths and things like that. Loved fairy tales. And The Scarlet Letter is very much a story that falls into the fairy tale genre. And fairy tales generally deal with either the reunion of two lovers, like a husband and wife, their union, or it deals with the reunion of a parent and a child. And Hawthorne uses a lot of misdirection to make you think he's telling one kind of a story. He's really telling another kind. And I haven't taught The Scarlet Letter since co-op days, and so I'm really looking forward to doing that. It's very sort of mind-blowing when you get to the end and realize what he's been doing.
That's super exciting. Well, that must then account for so much of Pearl, and so much of her, her personality. I'll just leave it there.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. What a fun thing. So you need to jump in here and take this course, so that you can read The Scarlet Letter and discover this golden nugget. Well, Mrs. Leary, we are grateful to have you at Kepler, and we appreciate what you bring to families, and so thankful for your experience, your heart for the students, and really for the way you've designed your courses. And in many ways, the epitome of what we want to see families experience through classical Christian education. Is there any last final word you'd like to leave with the audience before we sign off?
I would just say teaching at Kepler has been a true joy. I have just had so many wonderful students who bring such great, already having really great critical thinking skills, and the questions that they're asking about the text create wonderful discussions. But one of my greatest joys too is having students repeat years, so coming through all the classes, and then having siblings come back through, so I get to know whole families that way, and that has just been so much fun. And then, as you know, having been able to connect with some at different conferences and meeting people in person that you already know. And I do think Kepler does a wonderful job for that for students as well, just creating an environment where these kids really do become friends even before they meet each other in real life. And that has just been a joy to experience.
It's fantastic. Well, all of Mrs. Leary's courses will be available in the show notes. You'll find links to her courses and links to her bio so you can learn more about her or contact her. Mrs. Leary, thank you so much for taking the time to be here, and God bless you all. Thank you for tuning in.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, folks.